Okay, I think we are rolling. So I want to welcome everyone who's joined us for this week's edition of the weekly webcast of the Objector Church. Your host for tonight is James Branum. And tonight I am hosting our webcast in a different location here at what will soon be my little office in the back of Nappy Ritz Books, a wonderful Black-owned bookstore here in Northeast Oklahoma City. So very excited to be here. Have a lot of work to get this space to be this little area. That'll be my office to be where I'd like it for future filming, but am excited to have a place that's a little more quiet in my home without any dogs or kids around. So anyway, excited about this, but we have a lot of work to do, and I had some issues with getting our internet working tonight. So that's the way it goes. Well, anyway, I want to welcome everyone. We have these every week. By the way, if you're not familiar with us, you can learn out more at our website at objector.church. But in these webcasts, we seek to inspire, we seek to inform, and we seek to interact, or to be more than just a two-way, more than just a one-way conversation, but actual more of a truly interactive experience. And we, as a community, we are a religious humanist community with a focus on peace and social justice issues. That informs a lot of what we do. One of the things we do at the beginning of our time together is we have a bit of an opening ritual, a welcoming time. And one of the things we do is lighting candles, and choosing candles as being something of a universal symbol that's not so distinctly tied to any one specific religious tradition. But since we are experimenting with rituals, it makes sense for us. I've kind of fleshed this one out a little bit more, and I really, we have been lighting 3 candles of late, but I think what I'm going to do a little bit different tonight, and we'll see how it works, is have a little bit of a different, well, I'll explain as we go along. So we're lighting 3 candles. The first one represents the past, those who've gone before us. And I'm thinking particularly about a dear friend who passed away this last week. Her name is Susan Lee. She was a Catholic worker, devoted anti-war activist for many, many years. I knew just bits and pieces of her history, more the recent part of her history. But I know that she did travel in 1999 to Iraq in defiance of U.S. law and the sanctions that were in place against Iraq at the time. Many do not realize that more people probably died because of the sanctions than did actually in the wars. That's how bad the sanctions were. And so remembering her tonight, she passed away very suddenly. I should say, too, just a bit more about her and her influence in my life. She was one of the co-founders for organization, the Center for Conscience and Action, which is an organization that's worked for quite a while now on issues of conscience, GI rights, and peace education. And so we're thinking about her tonight and honoring her with our first candle. By the way, if you have someone you'd like to honor, someone that you've lost, please share their name in the comments. We'll be sure and read their names as well. But tonight we're starting by lighting a candle for the past, and this one specifically for Susan Lee. And so as we light this candle, we're setting our intention of remembering all those who've gone before us, all those who are important in our lives. And we seek for them to not be forgotten, but for their lives to continue through our hearts and through our work. So now for our second candle, this one is for the future. And it represents young people and those who are yet to be born, but the generations that come after us, and all of our hopes and aspirations and yearnings for them. So as we light this candle for the future, we're thinking of them, and we're again recommitting ourselves to making the world better for them, to be thinking ahead to generations to come, and to know that our journey here on planet Earth is not just about us, it's about them too. And then finally, our last candle, and maybe our most important candle in some way, is a candle for the present. Because while we are informed by the past, we hope for the future. It's the present that is this moment in time. So in lighting this candle for the present, we are taking a moment for ourselves, saying that this moment is special. This moment is important. It's a time of resolving ourselves again of what's important. So as you light this candle, I invite you to take a moment to take a deep breath. Take a deep breath out. And to know that this moment is ours. This moment, we are here on planet Earth. This is our moment. And the question is, what will we do with it? And so invite you now, taking this time out here for our time together as a community, that this is, I just want to thank you for taking this time out. It's important. So, anyway, that's our opening ritual. It's really just a time of reflection, a time of recommitment. And again, I just want to invite anyone who has things they want to share, of anyone who's passed on. I think this is a part of our ritual we'll be adding in the future, is if there's someone that has passed on recently. In fact, you can email me ahead of time at James@Objector.Church. I'm glad to add them to the list of names we'll be reading. But also invite people, if it's the anniversary, if someone special has passed on, you just want to think about them. Again, send me their names and we'll read them as part of this opening ritual. So now, for the rest of our time together, today we'll be talking, I have a topic I'll be discussing, but the end also has some announcements. So for the topic, and this is one that has really intrigued me of late, and it's been, it's just super interesting, and that is I've read a couple of books, or I should say I've listened to some audiobooks that dealt with religions that have gone bad, religions that have moved in a toxic direction. And these two books, one of them dealt with the Church of Scientology. The other book was about the People's Temple. And if the People's Temple doesn't ring a bell, then the word Jonestown probably does. This was the religious community that eventually located itself in Jonestown, Guyana, and then killed itself, mostly through mass suicides at the instigation of their leader. There are also more than a few murders, and that's a whole other subject. Not everyone who died at Jonestown did so willingly. But in both of these cases, in reading these books, I reflect a lot on them because I've spent a lot of time in my life trying to make sense of the good parts and bad parts of my own religious background. And I spent time in several religious traditions, and I'd have to say I'm pretty religious in a sense in how I see the world and engage with it. And yet I know that religion can be toxic, it can be harmful. I've seen it, I've experienced it. I've also seen the good parts. And so I think it's really important to spend a lot of time reflecting on this issue of what happens when religion goes bad. Because religion by its nature deals with the big stuff, issues of ultimate meaning, worth, purpose, value, ethics. The positive is that religion at its best moments has called people to take stands for justice, has enabled people to be willing to break the laws, human laws, for the sake of the greater good. That's good news. Bad news, religion when it goes bad abuses children. Religion when it's bad creates violence. Religion when it goes bad creates creepy power dynamics, controlling people's lives and ruining them, and again leading to death and mayhem. I think it would be fair to say that religion is one of the most powerful forces in the world, for good or for evil. And so I think it's really important to dig down deep and look at how religious traditions can go bad, and to be able to spot when things start going bad, and then to take steps to hopefully keep that from happening and or to reboot things. So I'm going to argue today that there are at least I can see 5 common symptoms that often come up when religious communities become toxic. These are not the only phenomenon of toxic religious communities, but I would argue that they are pretty common. And when these things come together, it can lead to really disastrous outcomes. And I think if you look at the examples from the Church of Scientology and its abuses, and if you look at the examples from the People's Temple, you see some of these same toxic symptoms. And yet, at the same time, here's what gets complicated. These toxic communities and others that have become toxic often have good elements too. It's not all bad. And so that's a part of the mix too. Before we go on, though, I want to invite, if you have questions, if you have comments, please feel free to post them on Facebook. It's probably the best way for us to have conversation along the way. So feel free to post them. I'll be able to respond to them as I go along. So of these toxic symptoms, the first one, it's all about us versus them thinking. Religious communities, or for that matter, any community, that becomes toxic in nature often emphasizes us versus them, boundaries, separations. Now, I'm not saying every community has boundaries. A sports team, you have to know who are the players. Any organization has boundaries, has membership, who is a part of things, who isn't. I'm not objecting that per se. What I am saying, though, is that communities that emphasize the separation, emphasize the distinctiveness, often this leads to bad outcomes, often because people become isolated from the broader community. This can lead to some, again, I would argue, some pretty negative things. In the cases of the Church of Scientology, in the book I read about them, this was very much the case, because people that leave the community, for whatever reason, are shunned. They are cut off, and because the church, while people are members of the church, they are encouraged to cut off ties with people who are not part of the community. Over time, it leads to people being more and more isolated, and if someone has to leave for whatever reason, they lose so many people in their lives. This happened again to the People's Temple, but it happens with many other religious communities. And I would argue that one of the most dangerous phenomena is us versus them thinking, and it plays out in many scenarios. That's symptom number one. Symptom number two, toxic religious communities make unreasonable demands of their members when it comes to time and money. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, any religious community calls its members for high levels of commitment. That's not unusual, because again, we're dealing with the big stuff, issues of meaning, purpose, value, stuff that's worth investing your life in. So obviously, in one sense, all religions call people to make big sacrifices. That's not unusual. However, there comes a point when an institution calls people to make sacrifices beyond reasonableness, beyond health, beyond sustainability. Now, in the books I've mentioned earlier about the Scientologist and People's Temple, those were extreme examples where people would spend almost all of their waking hours, if not at work, doing church work, doing work of this religious institution. But I've seen this in other less extreme cases. I've been a part of churches that had so many activities all the time, and it's a fair amount of pressure to participate, that it was very easy for members to be downright worn out by participating. With money, though, that's another one. And again, religious institutions, like all institutions, have to fundraise. That's not unusual. But there comes a point when is an institution using coercive means, creepy means, to get people to give more than they really ought to? In, again, the cases of the Church of Scientology and of the People's Temple, people were encouraged to go into debt if necessary, to give more and more to their organizations. I would argue anytime you have a religious institution or any other institution making unreasonable demands, unsustainable demands, unhealthy demands, that's a problem. One of the questions I would ask for anyone in a religious community is to ask is the participation in the community making your family life better or worse? If it's worse, you have to ask, is this really a good thing? Okay, so that's the second symptom of toxic religious communities. The third symptom, and this is a biggie, sex. Yes, sexuality is an obsession of many religious people, no doubt about that. But I think there's a certain level of toxicity that becomes worse in communities when the emphasis is not about ethics. It isn't about making responsible decisions that's healthy for yourself and your sexual partners, but rather it's about control. And often this control, by the way, is leveled out or dished out in varying degrees. We'll talk a little bit later about the idea of hierarchy in toxic religious communities, but often the rules are different for the leaders than they are for the lower ranking people. Also, in many religious communities, the rules for women and men are different too. That's a problem. And I would argue that why do toxic religious communities want to control sexuality? Well, I think in part of it, and I don't think it's so much a conscious decision, but I think subconsciously, I think that for charismatic religious leaders, if you can control someone in such a personal, intimate way as their sex life, it's a great way to send the message that all parts of life are subject to control by the toxic religious institution. And I would say, I'll give you another example in the present day right now. If you're following the news, we're hearing a lot about the rise of white supremacy in this country and white supremacist organizations, groups like the Proud Boys and folks like them. Well, one of the things I find intriguing from a sociological standpoint is if you dig into these groups and read about them, one thing that's very common is often they have extreme rules on their members' sex lives. One of the groups, a white supremacist organization, had a rule that they forbid their members from masturbating. Quite literally, that was a rule, or having gay sex. Those are the two things that were forbidden. Why? Why? Well, again, it's about control. And there's something about this dynamic, and I've seen this not just in creepy cults, not just in white supremacist organizations, but even in fairly mainstream churches, where they want to get in people's business, personal, private business, and control. That's a problem, in my opinion. Now, again, I think it's fair game to talk about ethics, to talk about how human beings treat each other, including sexually. That's fine. But there's something else when religious leaders want to control the sex lives of their congregants. That's a warning sign to me. 4, I think, deals with hierarchy. Toxic religious communities love hierarchy. They love control. They love systems that keep people fearful. And if you look at the history of the Church of Scientology, you look at the history of People's Temple, and these two examples, control was a huge part of it. Blackmail, finding out personal information about congregants and later using that as leverage to control behavior in various kinds of ways. I would argue that you have to be very careful in any organization when hierarchy becomes the norm, and when you have this tiered kind of system, and a key element is information control, and using that information control as leverage to keep people in a subordinate position. Now, many organizations are hierarchical in nature. That part isn't unusual, but in a toxic community, it is not just about a chain of command to deal with practical issues. It's about something more than that. It's about controlling aspects of one's life beyond just what's related to mission. The last symptom, in my opinion, of toxic religious communities deal with the issue of critical thinking, and that is that critical thinking is discouraged and or forbidden. In both of the books I was talking about earlier, you see this as very much part of it. When people ask questions, they ask too many questions, they become ostracized, and in time, they get kicked out of the organization or punched in other ways. I would argue any organization where you see critical thinking being discouraged, being something to be fearful of, that is a real problem. So again, these 5 symptoms, and I'm not saying that these are the only symptoms of toxic religion, but I think these are ones that we should be looking for. Again, just to recap, let's see. Hierarchy, unreasonable demands of time and money, desire to control sex lives, us versus them thinking, and again, the fear of critical thinking. These phenomenon are present in almost every organization, by the way, to some degree or another. I'm not saying that these are, they're often present in small degrees. The issue is when they reach a tipping point of dangerousness. I would also argue, though, that it's not just religious organizations we need to be on the lookout for. We also need to consider other organizations that may not be traditionally thought of as being religious, and yet function as religion, and since they function as religions, these organizations can have toxic outcomes. Now, I'm going to make the case today that an organization that I would argue is religious, even though it may not state it as being such, is the U.S. military. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you define religion, as I do, in this broader sociological context, it has nothing to do with whether you believe in God or gods or not. Rather, it's about systems of rituals, practices, cultures that convey meaning, purpose, identity, value, ethics. Does the military do that? Yes. How does it do that? One, it is a separate culture with its own lingo, its own verbiage. Everything has a different name for it than it does in the civilian world. Great example, if you're in the military, what do you call the outer shirt of your uniform? Most of us in the civilian world call that a shirt. In the military, it's called a blouse. You know, generally, I grew up when I was a kid, I heard a blouse is a female shirt. In the military, a blouse is anybody's uniform shirt. There's tons of other such terms. Yeah, different terms for the bathroom, different terms for everything in the world, plus the ridiculous amount of acronyms. All of these things, what they do is they serve to send a message to the culture of the military that we are our own little group and outsiders aren't welcome. They can't even speak our language. What else? Well, the military seeks to convey ultimate value and worth. Many young people who join the military, why do they join? A lot of them is for money, for college, or not, but for many of them, it's about identity and value and worth. It's so they can be somebody, they can have value, they can have worth. What else can we say about the military in making this argument that it functions as a religion? Well, it seeks to convey ultimate meaning. For instance, most human beings have a natural aversion to killing. Now, any of us put in the right position can kill another person, I would argue. If our lives are in danger, so loved one's life's in danger, yes, any of us, I think, can kill. But why is killing, as a general rule, fairly rare in human society? It's because it's something that we're hardwired to not do unless it's absolutely necessary. There's some really good books on the subject, the book On Killing. I forgot the author's name, but talks about this in detail, how that in major firefights in war, there were times when it's now pretty solid evidence from archaeology and other things that majority of service members did not fire their weapons, even in major firefights. You're talking about in the Civil War, we're talking about even in World War II. Why is that? A natural aversion to killing. The military, though, it says, don't listen to your instincts. The question is, you must kill because the government says to, not because your life is in danger, because the government tells you to. That, I would argue, is a religious kind of claim. It is making a claim of ultimate value and worth and telling people they should be able to act upon that. By the way, I'm going to go, we have a few comments and people. Before I want to thank Serena, Lamont, and Daniel for joining us tonight. And Daniel posted a comment. I don't understand it, so maybe he can explain a little bit more, but he posted, it's a socialist culture that defends capitalism. Okay, Daniel, I don't understand that one, so if you could post that, that would be helpful. Or elaborate a little bit more, would be appreciated. For anyone else, though, as well, if you have comments, questions along the way, please feel free to post them. I try to stop every few minutes to check comments and respond. Okay, so anyway, if you buy my argument that the military is a kind of religion, and again, it's dealing with ultimate values and worth, then is it a healthy religion or a toxic one? Well, if you use my 5 criteria I discussed a moment ago, I would argue it is a toxic religion. For instance, hierarchy, absolutely, boatloads of hierarchy. A tiered structure where people at the upper levels are held to a very different standard, often a much lower standard of behavior than those in the enlisted rank and file. That's how hierarchy works in toxic religious organizations. What about unreasonable demands of time and money? Well, in one sense, this wouldn't seem like it'd be the case, because in the military, service members are paid for their service rather than contributing like you would to a church. On the other hand, let's ask this question. The average low-level enlisted service member, how much are they paid? Are they paid a reasonable amount for the labor? I would argue no. In fact, I would argue that for many of them, there are times in military service members' life that they are lucky if they're even making minimum wage. If you factor in time that they are on the clock, time that they are required to be doing something by the military, it's not just the work days, it's quite a bit past that. Times when they are controlled Their lives are controlled in various ways. And I'd point out these examples. In the civilian world, for instance, under state law, if you're in a state that allows medical marijuana, you could use medical marijuana under state law. Remember, the military cannot do that because their lives are controlled off the clock, not just on the clock. What they wear, clothing choices, even off post, often are stipulated by military regulation. Their sex lives, military members are controlled in ways, again, that they are not controlled in the civilian sector. In other words, in the civilian world, when you're off the clock, you're off the clock. Again, some employers try to control behavior off the clock, but that's a dangerous territory legally, because an employee can show that if they're actually doing work off the clock, they should get paid for it. And if they're not being paid, they can bring a wage and labor complaint against them under state law. Military, don't have to worry about this. So I would argue, again, if you look at the way military families are treated as well, they're often very unreasonable demands on time and money. What about controlling sex? Absolutely. One thing I thought civilians may not know, in the military, behavior that in the civilian world we might think of as unethical maybe, it's illegal in the military. Adultery, cheating on your spouse, again, frowned upon in civilian society, but there's a remedy to that. It's called divorce. A legal process. You can go to end your marriage because you're either incompatible, your spouse is cheating, whatever. In the military, though, what's the remedy for someone cheating on their spouse? Potentially, it's jail. People go to prison for committing adultery. In fact, arguably, quite a few sexual practices that may be enjoyed by consenting adults are actually against the law under the military regulations, and people can and sometimes are prosecuted for them. Why? I would argue again, it's this toxic kind of religion. It's not just about the mission. It's about controlling service members and keeping them in this toxic culture. In other words, there's no rational reason why the military cares about your sex life off post, off duty. Nonetheless, it does. And again, I would argue it's for fairly toxic reasons. In other words, what I'm trying to argue is that these symptoms of toxicity, I'm sorry, I forgot one of the biggies I should forgot to mention. Fear of critical thinking. Again, military, they invented the old saying, we don't pay you to think. Low-ranking enlisted personnel are disempowered over and over and over again. Decisions are made by the brass, not by the rank and file. Theoretically, this country is supposed to be a democracy. Why is it that we use this aristocratic system from Europe as how we govern the military? Well, the reason is that the military is a religion, and that's a toxic one. So, what do we do with that? Well, before we answer that question, I want to go to comments now. Daniel went on. He earlier, I asked him to explain his earlier comment, and he said his explanation was the military is a socialist organization that defends capitalism. Socialism is a religion. That's interesting. I'm not sure I would at all agree that the military is a socialist organization. I'm not buying that, Daniel. I will agree with you that socialism can function as a religion, though. I'll agree with you on that part. I would say that any kind of political philosophy, if it has those elements of ultimate worth, meaning, value, etc., could function religiously. So I will agree with you on that. I'm not buying the argument that the military itself is a socialist. The military is a socialist phenomenon, because it's not, in my opinion. Also want to welcome Terry, who's joined us. Thank you so much for tuning in. By the way, for anyone who is watching, if you like what you're hearing, please feel free to share this on social media. We'd love to get the word out about what we're doing. Okay, so continuing on our conversation, we've been talking about toxic forms of religion, of the dangers of what happens when religion becomes toxic in nature. So the question is now, what do we do with that? Well, for folks who are part of mainstream religions, leaving an organization like the Church of Scientology is a whole different matter. Those kind of organizations, there's some really creepy, coercive dynamics that come into play that make it very difficult for people to leave. Often to leave such an organization means cutting off ties with your family and friends who may still be a part of the organization. But I've seen this happen in maybe not quite so extreme examples, but other church settings where people leave, they often feel pretty cut off. And so I think it's important for, if we care about people stuck in situations like this, to be ready to help them, to support them in various ways, so they don't feel alone, they don't feel isolated. I think that I would also argue that works very similarly. As I mentioned, my argument that the military itself is a religion and a toxic one. People that leave the military, it's often the process is not easy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you're buying my argument that the military is a religion because it conveys identity, purpose, meaning, all of that, then for someone to leave the military often means losing those things. Now, for some, their identity is now found in being a veteran, and that can be deeply meaningful to many. But for others, the process of leaving, particularly if they've lost their buy-in to the institution and its values, to leave the military can be a painful thing. And so I think that's where people like you and I who are watching, we may be concerned about things. We may want to work for peace. But I think we have to remember the people that are stuck in the system. We got to show them love. We have to reach out to them. I think one of the mistakes at some points in history has been sometimes, not nearly as much as might be commonly believed, but at times, the anti-war movement has not been as welcoming to veterans and service members as it should be. And we have to remember that people that have been stuck in the system, it's not easy to leave. And so we have to show kindness, show respect, and also to remember that not everything is bad. In the military, as I'm a civilian attorney, but I work mostly with the people in the military. A lot of my clients, even those who are very glad to leave the military for various reasons, also often experience a great deal of grief in the process of leaving. And many of them even have regrets about it in time. Because in the military, they had family. In the military, they had community. In other words, they weren't left by themselves. And I think as a community, for us with the Objector Church, we're seeking to build a peace-based community. Part of it is we have to be ready to step in and have the doors open to those who are leaving the military, who are leaving other oppressive institutions, and to accept them as where they're coming in from, and to be willing also to hear from them the times about the good stuff from their experiences. It's not going to be all bad. It's not all black and white. But to know that this grief process is real. I would also argue, though, that there's a place for different kinds of religious community. For people who have been burnt by religion, often it can be really hard to start over. Whether you're leaving the military, whether you're leaving a creepy, coercive religious institution, or any other kind of institution. And so one of the things we've tried to do with the Objector Church is we're trying to provide a safe space for people to come to who are yearning for community, but don't yet have a place to connect and are really skittish about community because they've seen what happens when it goes bad. So anyway, that's what I'm going to leave us with for tonight. Would love to have more comments and questions from folks out there on this subject and others. By the way, if you have thoughts, you're always welcome to post them here on Facebook. You can also shoot me an email. My email is james@objector.church. And now I want to move into giving a few announcements. One announcement coming up, we are, for the Oklahoma congregation of the Objector Church, we are putting together, we're going to be starting to have some monthly gatherings, in-person gatherings, flesh and blood gatherings, real people, not just people online. And so we're having the first one, and let me double check on the date of that. But I believe it's going to be coming up on June 2nd, Sunday, June 2nd. In the evening, we'll be having it here at Nappy Ritz Books, Northeast 37th and Kelly. If you want to have more information about this, you can find it on Facebook. We want to welcome people to this. We'd love to have lots of folks come out. We're going to be having hopefully some music. We're going to have a speaker. We'll have some refreshments, conversation. It'll be very low key, but I think it'll be a lot of fun. So encourage you to come check us out for that. We're hoping to have these every first Sunday of the month if everything works out as we're hoping. So that's in the works. Other stuff happening, I will be traveling this week to the National GI Rights Network Conference in Chicago. I'm not going to have a ton of free time while I'm there, but I may have a little bit. So if any of you watching are in the Chicago area and would like to meet up and talk about the Objector Church and what we're about, would love to visit with you. So shoot me an email if you're in the Chicago area and like to meet while I'm in town. My email is james@objector.church. I do think we'll probably still have a regular webcast next week. One thing I will mention though for our webcast next week, I think part of our time together will be a memorial of sorts for Susan Lee. I mentioned her at the beginning of the webcast. She's a dear friend, one of our co-founders of the Center for Conscience and Action here in Oklahoma. Was somebody who traveled to Iraq in 1999 as part of Voices in the Wilderness. Lots we'd like to remember about her. So we'll be sharing about that next Sunday, a regular webcast time. So if you'd like to participate, if you have some remembrances of her, things you'd like to share, shoot me an email, james@objector.church with those. You can also, of course, always participate in the comments as well. So those are main things. The last thing I want to mention is just as a community, for us to continue this work, we really do need some help on the fundraising side of things. So if you have a few bucks you can throw our way, we'd very much appreciate it. You can donate at objector.church/donate. We also, if you would like to become a member of our community, there's information there as well at our website. So I think we're going to close it there for tonight. Again, apologize for our time delay. Had some issues here at this is a new location for us to do the webcast. So next time I'm going to have things better set up and we'll have it looking a little more like a real studio next week. So anyway, tune in and between now and then. One last thing. I am shooting some short videos on topics of interest to our community. They'll be coming out maybe 1 or 2 a week, and we really want to get some traction on these on social media. So if you see these videos, you can find them at our Facebook page, Objector.Church. They're about 2 to 3 minutes long. Please watch them. Please share them. Please comment on them. Really, really would appreciate it. And also, if you have an idea for a cool 2 or 3 minute video exploring some issue of interest to our community, again, love to hear from you. Shoot me an email at james@objector.church. Well, we're going to end it there for this week, and thank you so much for tuning in. Adios, and bye now.